Hello, I'm Rika. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I made this Edwardian petticoat. I found Reconstructing History's 5-core pattern RH953 and I embarked on a journey full of confusion. I was uncertain whether it was meant to be a skirt or a petticoat, so I decided to use the same pattern for both the petticoat and the skirt. I have this delicious aubergine pure wool fabric for a walking skirt. I start working on it as soon as I found a decent fabric for the lining. But first I wanted a petticoat. I made a mock-up from some old bed sheets. The yoke was ridiculously out of proportion, so if you choose this pattern, be prepared for the challenge, but the end result is worth taking the trouble. The yoke you can see here is the result of several attempts to make it look decent, but still not what I wanted. Also, the seam needed to be moved about an inch closer to the center front. The front and the yoke patterns have the same curve, which makes it easy to join them, however, they create a protruding hump on your tummy when sewn together. I remembered I had a truly Victorian bag pattern. I tried to use that. It was closer to what I wanted, but it didn't have the dramatic shape I was going for. After half a dozen new attempts, I made this yoke. I was quite satisfied with it. Here you can see the RH yoke pattern, the TV bed pattern and my own pattern compared. As you can see, all the two are completely different. Mine is somewhere halfway between the two commercial patterns. I much preferred mine. It only needed some minor adjustment. It had the curves I was aiming for. I tried the paper pattern around my waist and I was very happy, to be honest. It was longer in the back because the yoke itself was going to be gathered as well. I think it looked extremely pretty even as a paper pattern. I cut the pattern pieces. I wanted to have more gathers at the back, so I decided to widen the back center gores. I cut the back panels on the selvage and the front panel on the fold. I marked the notches on both sides. I didn't have to alter the side pieces. I also cut 2 yokes on the fold, and when I thought I was done with the cutting, I realized I hadn't taken away the 1 inch from the front seam, so it was time to do that. I always forget something when cutting out the pieces. I also decided to cut away the selvage from the back centers because it was too ugly and I wanted a neat back seam. To join the gores, I was going to make French seams. I marked a line about 5 mm away from the edge in order to be able to sew in a straight line. I basted the pieces. Then I sewed them together with a running stitch, wrong sides together. I tried to make as tiny stitches as possible. If you want to construct this petticoat, whenever I hand sew, you can use your machine. I trimmed the seams shorter. I was aiming for a seam about 4 mm wide. After removing the basting stitch, I turned the pieces to the wrong side and stitch them again, this time with the back stitch. Actually, running stitches would have been sufficient as well. I regret making the placket the way I did, but I can't help it now. I simply folded the seams twice and top stitched from the right side. I found it rather difficult to make the placket when a French seam was used. After sewing all the seams and finishing the placket, I pinned the yoke on and I decided I wanted side seams in the yoke because I realized I needed to reinforce it and also I wouldn't have had anything to attach the ties to. I marked where I wanted the side seams and I sewed them with the back stitch. I placed the yokes right sides together. I backstitched them together on the top and center back, but I left a ½ inch gap in the center back for the tunnel for the tie. Then I first folded the back center seams and then the top seams, so all seams will be protected from friction when the tie is pulled. Then I turned the yoke to the right side, and here you can see the openings of the tunnel. Next, I top stitched the top of the yoke from center back to center back, then from side seam to center back about a centimeter below the first stitching line, carefully stitching down the seams inside the yoke as well. So I stitched through 4 layers. This way I created the tunnel for the tie. I cut 2 pieces of ties, but they weren't wide, so I only used them temporarily. You, however, should use your permanent ties at this point so that you can save yourself from future trouble. I secured the ends at the side seams with pins, which resulted in many accidents later on. I tried on the yoke and loved it so much. Unfortunately, the 2 layers ceased to be symmetrical, so I had to have that with scissors. I marked the seam allowance along the yoke front and folded it back. I gathered the top of the petticoat from the side seam to the center back. I pinned the outer yoke on the petticoat from the center back to the side seam. I have no footage of it, but I basted and stitched it from the side seam to the center back. Then I laid down the petticoat. I matched the seam allowance of the front to the seam allowance of the yoke. Remember, the seam allowance of the yoke was folded. Then I folded down the other yoke, pinned and pasted it into place. I basted the inner yoke to the petticoat from the side seam to the back center. No footage again, but I also gathered, pinned and pasted the other side of the petticoat to the yoke as well. Next, I top stitched along the whole yoke. I think it turned out really lovely. I put the petticoat on to check the length. It was too long in the back. I wanted the back to be just a bit longer than the front. Don't judge me harshly, but I prefer my skirts longer in the back. I marked the required length. I folded back the extra fabric and tried the petticoat on again, and I like this length. I whip stitched the hem. I don't remember, but I think I made it about 2 centimeters less than an inch wide. Next, I measured 40 cm wide strips of fabric to make the flounce. I could only make 5, but 6 would have been the ideal. I used a French seam to join the ends. I don't remember the width of my fabric, but I ended up with an about 6.5 meter long strip. I made a rolled hem. First, I made a narrow fold, then I drove the needle through just below the bottom edge of the fold, then just below the top edge of the fold, and I pulled the thread through, but I didn't make a tight stitch. I made about 5 stitches, creating a zigzag before I pulled the thread tight, which rolled up the folded hem. I also trimmed along the frayed edge to make sure I got a nice and neat hem. It took hours to finish, but I enjoyed every second of it. Not perfect, but every time I look at it, I smile. I divided the strip into 4 equal sections because it made gathering and assembling relatively easy. I also divided the hem of the petticoat into 4 equal parts. I gathered the flounce one section at a time. Again, it took ages. And I just pulled and pulled and pulled. Then I cut the hem of the petticoat through the folded edge because I was going to set the gathered edge of the flounce in the hem. I turned under the 2 edges inside the hem so that they were facing. I pinned the gathers to one of the folded edges of the hem. I have no footage of it, but you already know that I like basting. I backstitched the gathers into place. While sewing, I carefully stroke the gathers. When you're sewing by hand, you have so much more control. It was a bit difficult to sew through a thick layer. When I got round, I trimmed the edge. Then I folded the other edge of the cut hem onto the gathers and I basted along it. Then I backstitched along the hem from the outside. I think I did a fairly good job. The whip stitch of the hem is visible, but I find it very decorative. I was going to put some lace over it, but I couldn't because I just love it as it is. I cut 2 narrow strips for the ties because, remember, I only had temporary ones. I folded the strips into half along the long side, then folded again both edges up to the line I just created in the middle. I top stitched the ties. Now I only had to attach them. However, because the yoke was sewn on the petticoat, to remove the safety pin, I had to unpick a few stitches in the yoke. So don't forget to attach your ties before you sew the yoke on. Since I made a hole in the bottom of the yoke, I had to leave the end of the tie long to be able to push the safety pin through. So I had to pull this end back to the side seam, and I didn't want to run over the side seam. I secured the ties with tiny tight stitches. And I was ready. If you like this video, please give it a thumb up and don't forget to subscribe.